I would like to say a warm welcome to everyone. My name is İpek Cem Taha, and I'm the director of Columbia Global Centers in Istanbul. Today, as the Global Centers Network, we're delighted to be presenting a timely conversation on the Perilous Public Square, Structural Threats to Free Expression Today, a collected volume of essays published by the Columbia University Press in June 2020. Edited by David Posen, the Perilous Public Square brings together leading thinkers to explore emerging threats to freedom of expression as they examine key structural changes in communication and forms of global capitalism. Addressing the widely varying issues related to free speech and technology, the freedom of press and assembly, access to information, the Perilous Public Square explores ways to preserve the essential features of a healthy democracy. Our book series, In Conversation With, between the Columbia Global Centers and the Columbia University Press, was launched also in June 2020, and this is our fifth such collaboration. It is inspired by a desire to bring global audiences together over a shared love of knowledge, a passion for books, and to give audiences like you direct access to authors of important works and cutting-edge ideas. Before we move on to our conversation, perhaps I should say a couple of words about Columbia Global Centers and also about Columbia University Press. The Global Centers, currently in 9 cities around the world, are hubs for the university that work with students, faculty, and local partners to create opportunities for shared learning and for research, and to deepen the nature of the global dialogue. Columbia University Press is one of the world's leading academic publishers. Now in its second century of publishing, it is the 4th oldest university press in the United States. Each year, the press publishes approximately 160 titles across a wide range of disciplines. Today's event will feature David Posen in conversation with Matthew Connelly and Tim Wu, and will be moderated by Emily Bazelon. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. First, Emily Bazelon is a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine, the Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law at Yale Law School, and a co-host of the Slate Political Gabfest, a popular weekly podcast. She is the author of 2 national bestsellers, Charged, about the power of prosecutors, and Sticks and Stones, about how to prevent bullying. David Posen is Charles Keller Beekman Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and served as the inaugural visiting scholar at the Knight First Amendment Institute. He is co-editor of Troubling Transparency, The History and Future of Freedom of Information, published by Columbia in 2018. In 2019, the American Law Institute awarded Posen its Early Career Scholars Medal. Tim Wu is the Julius Silver Professor at Columbia Law School and the author of The Master Switch, The Rise and Fall of Information Empires, published in 2011. The Attention Merchants, The Epic Scramble to Get Inside Our Heads, published in 2016, and The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age, 2018. Wu is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and also has written for Slate, The New Yorker, and The Washington Post. Matthew Connelly is a professor of history at Columbia and principal investigator of History Lab, a project to use data science to preserve historical accountability in the age of big data. He is also the co-director of the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy. His next book, to be published by Pantheon, is A History of Official Secrecy in the United States. I'd like to give the floor now to Emily, and welcome again, everyone.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be here today to talk about this book, which I just think is an excellent volume. I'm going to hold up my copy. For really anybody who is interested in free speech and disinformation, which to me just seems like a crucial topic of our era. This is just a fabulous collection of thinkers and arguments and historical patterns and data. It really is tremendously rich, and I congratulate David especially for putting it together and all of you for contributing to it. So I'm going to start with David as the editor of this volume. David, at the beginning of your introductory essay, you write that we live at a time when free speech is under attack. But then you pose this question, which I think is so important: under attack from what? And I wonder what you think the kind of competing pressures and forces are, and why you think that's actually not a simple, obvious question at this particular moment.
Thanks so much, Emily. And thanks to everyone for coming to this event. That opening observation in the introduction responds to the fact that I think there are multiple narratives out there, competing narratives about how free speech is under attack, although everyone seems to agree with that basic proposition. On the political right, there's, in particular, there's a narrative that cancel culture, as it's sometimes called, or campus political correctness, is a stifling non-orthodox intellectual positions and free speech. And I was actually quoting Justice Samuel Alito from a Supreme Court decision when he said that free speech is under attack. And he was a little bit cryptic, but pretty clearly, I think he had in mind these forces that are demanding trigger warnings or safe spaces or disinviting unpopular speakers. And in his view, shared by many on the right in this country, that's where the key threat comes from to free speech. On the political left, there's a very different narrative that points to specific Supreme Court decisions applying the First Amendment as themselves a threat to free speech, because they're privileging the expressive interests of corporations and well-heeled donors above the expressive interests of ordinary people. And so Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United, striking down part of a major campaign finance law, or Hobby Lobby, have been attacked on grounds that the First Amendment is being weaponized against ordinary people's free speech in this plutocratic fashion. Those two narratives are important, and they've already, however, received lots of attention from legal scholars. And it was less clear to me as editor and to my colleagues at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia how much value we could add in discussing those themes. So instead, we tried to invite prominent thinkers like Tim Wu and Matt Connelly to address what we call structural threats to the system of free expression that don't emanate from specific court rulings or from what's happening on campus or in necessarily in journalistic circles, but rather looking across the platforms that dominate our digital lives and asking, what are the threats to free speech today that have not already been addressed as First Amendment problems, or already been addressed as ones, in the culture war debates over political correctness? Things to do with, as Tim's chapter discusses, propaganda robots, troll armies, fake news disseminating at scale online, or as Matt's chapter discusses, the quiet collapse of the archives that the government keeps of its official activities. And we thought we could add more value as a volume by bringing together people to think broadly and structurally about these threats to the entire system of democratic discourse. So that's the direction the book went, looking mainly at life online and looking at threats that are not reducible to specific actions by discrete individuals, like them or dislike them, but rather flow from the way in which we organize our lives online and the system of capitalist production today.
So I think one of the crucial questions the book asks is whether what kind of room there is for regulation and limits on speech in the name of greater equity, of not privileging wealthier corporate interests, in light of our American First Amendment tradition. Because of course the quote from Justice Alito that you were talking about has a very different conception of threat in mind and of who is powerful and needs to be kind of countered in the story. So Tim, you titled your essay, "Is the First Amendment Obsolete?" A nice provocative question to ask. And you have this point you make, which I think is really important, where you say that the use of speech as a tool to suppress speech is by its nature something that's very challenging for the First Amendment to deal with. I think for a lot of people, that's a kind of unfamiliar concept, especially in the United States, because we are very devoted to the idea that more speech is always better, that there's this marketplace of ideas. I think a lot of still popular faith in the concept that good ideas will triumph in that marketplace, even though I think scholars and philosophers have been challenging that notion for a very long time. But when you think about the use of speech as a tool to suppress speech, what kinds of specifics are you talking about? And what do we do about that in a world in which I think we probably all share the fundamental premise that free speech is a core pillar of democracy?
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I do think we're in a time where, a lot of, as we've already heard, a lot of our sort of intuitions or what we feel we know about speech are kind of up for grabs. When I hear Republicans basically calling for a fairness doctrine on social media, I know like something that the Republican Party, especially Reagan, spent decades riling against the fairness doctrine, just as some people may know, as this like liberal conspiracy. And now they've suddenly, devoted the White House to trying to establish something like that. So everything is spun around. Let me try to answer your question a little bit with context. So the reason I said in this piece that the First Amendment was obsolete is the sense that we are used to a certain kind of environment for speech, one in which it is, the sort of 19th century, 20th century concept of it was that speakers are relatively few. They all have important things to say in this debate, and the evil government, this enormous ogre, might, swoop down and throw one of them in prison for saying something it doesn't agree with, and we need to stop that. And so that kind of paradigm, which I think most of us agree, that's not what we would like to have happen, animates what the First Amendment offers protections for, at least most straightforwardly. And now, why is that? I mean, that's good. I don't think speakers should be thrown in jail for saying things government disagrees with, but I don't think that's really how powerful entities try to control speech at this point in history. And as you said earlier, I think most of the techniques that are used to control speech now are in a different category that maybe propaganda is the right category, maybe disinformation. Whatever it is, they are efforts to use speech as a weapon. And I want to describe more than, say, 3 ways in which that happens. So one way to sort of, now what the idea here is controlling the speech environment. So you're fighting for what are people receiving? What are listeners getting as what they believe to be true? And one way you can weaponize speech is just to flood the zone with, what sometimes people call fake news, some disinformation. Even fake news has kind of been lost as a term too. But, just let's take the idea that there's been a massive amount of fraud in the 2020 election. The amount of which nobody has been able to establish any factual basis for. Nonetheless, I saw a recent poll suggesting that some extraordinary number of people now believe that to be true, based on the broadcast of and domination and total repeating of the message over and over and over again, flooding the zone. Some people call that reverse censorship. Just put so much information out there on a topic that the sort of truth gets, or the other side gets lost. Now that's kind of actually one where you do hear more of the same on both sides, but that general tactic, particularly in other countries, China, Turkey are very good examples, can be very effective, where you completely drown out another side. And I think that's become a big strategy. Another means of weaponizing, I don't want to go on forever, repeat the whole paper, is attacking speakers with speech. Rounding up troll armies to sort of attack, harass, try to put people out of business of wanting to say certain things. That's another method. I actually think it was a bigger deal when I wrote this paper. I think it's kind of, for some reason, maybe people have gotten used to it or something, just being attacked. And those are some of the methods. And I think they're very uncomfortable for the First Amendment to deal with. A massive disinformation campaign can be as powerful as a censorship campaign, sometimes more powerful. But as we said, the First Amendment is like this algorithm that sees speech as good and censorship is bad, and so is very, very poor at dealing with this. I know I've gone on a little too much, but I'll say one last thing. I think historically, another relevant thing here we cannot get away from is the role of the news media traditionally in doing a large amount of work to keep conspiracy, rumors, insanity kind of out of public discourse. If this were, I'm not saying everything was great about the 50s or 60s, but in the 50s, if you were a person claiming that Hugo Chavez had written a computer program to throw the election of the United States 7 years out of the grave or whatever, wouldn't end up being covered on the news, maybe on a comedy show, but it wouldn't end up, being, because there was 3 networks and a couple of, and they had ethics, which suggested not printing rumors, unsupported facts, gossip, and that kind of stuff. Obviously, those, at least in some institutions, press institutions, I don't know if I can call them press, first, also the social media, but also even some parts of the press have abandoned those rules. And I think that is the reason the technique has got more effective. So I hope I haven't had too much confusion in here. There's a lot of moving parts, but basically I think that to boil it down, this sort of, sole dissident holding his pamphlet on the corner being arrested, that's what the First Amendment's concerned is, but that's not what we're seeing.
Thank you so much. That's great. And I want to pick up on some of those threads in a minute. But first, Matt, I wanted to turn to you because you wrote about a sort of adjacent topic in the volume, which is the problem of government secrecy. And you're particularly concerned with the archiving practices of the government and the ways in which there is so much classification and other ways of keeping government information secret that we are just having a huge problem in terms of what you call a kind of digital dark age of government secrecy. So I was wondering how you think that fits into the kinds of problems Tim and David are outlining.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Tim was just talking about, if you imagine, in the future, looking back, how is it we're going to adjudicate the kinds of claims that are coming out of this election? I think many of us, not just historians, would think that ultimately, the records will come out, people who are still in the heat of battle and unwilling to speak freely will one day, give interviews and discuss what happened, and that there will be fair-minded scholars, who are going to be able to collect all this evidence, right, and to try to render impartial judgment. I think that's a noble sentiment. But speaking as an historian, I could tell you that that proposition that there will one day be a kind of court of history that's going to help sort all this out and educate perhaps the next generation. Unfortunately, that kind of work is getting more and more difficult. And it's because of the kinds of decisions that are being made right now about the preservation of information, preservation of a historical record. Not just by government, by the way, but also by the private sector, right? The companies that are collecting data like our email and our text messages and all the rest of it, who, as far as I can tell, feel that they have no duty to history in the sense of preserving some record of those communications that all of us think, in some cases anyway, might be important and that someday someone might want to look back on. So if you think about it, if we're talking about the First Amendment, right? The first thing we think about is speech and being able to express oneself freely. But what are we talking about, right? What are those things we know and can know? The problem with secrecy and the problem with the destruction of these historical records is that we won't even know what we don't know. It's something that David Posen has written about. It's a form of deep secrecy, right? The things we don't even know we don't know. So that's a problem. It's a problem right now if you believe in an open and accountable government, but it's a problem that really has been building over decades because of fundamental neglect and even disinterest in our senior political leaders in both parties to try to maintain the principle of accountable government.
So I want to turn to a question that that your introduction made me think about, Tim, which is, so you were talking about the gatekeeper function that traditional media used to play, and we kind of go back to this era in which there were only 3 news networks and everybody listened to Walter Cronkite, and there was this shared set of facts, not opinions, but in the United States, a kind of shared set of facts, which I was not alive for this period, but I also see it with this kind of amber glow. It sounds very attractive. On the other hand, we are living in a moment where it's the president of the United States who is spreading conspiracy theories about, the election system being hacked, and literally the kind of most baseless false claims are coming straight from Trump. So do we have a free speech problem more generally, or do we have a President Trump problem, at least in the United States? Because I think even Walter Cronkite would have to cover statements coming directly from the president. Sometimes I wonder if my own fear and concern about disinformation is more affected than I even realize by the way in which Trump is using the media and his Twitter feed and his television interviews. And it's been really interesting to see him turn on Fox in the last month since the election, as they've been sort of semi-reality based. So I wonder, I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on that, but Tim, maybe you could start.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. We'll have a natural experiment coming up, I guess. We'll see what happens going forward. But I really think that this is an area where people who are interested in free expression, the First Amendment, sometimes have a bit of a blind spot, especially lawyers, by neglecting the role that media ethics have played as kind of the secondary function in figuring out what actually gets heard. When you really think about it, there's never been a period or a forum where everyone could actually just reach the public at will before. It's sort of a mythology. And, sometimes we think, well, the guy in the corner, but the guy in the corner probably reached like 15 people who didn't, ignore. And now, sort of the Federalist Papers are this grand example. Maybe that's like the greatest example of pamphleteers ever. But I don't think it was ever actually that easy to reach large audiences in an unfiltered way. This is the internet age. Now, I'm not saying everything was good about journalistic ethics, but I think the core journalistic ethics of not reprinting unsupported information as news, not printing rumors and gossip, and not printing defamatory materials without some kind of support. That they're pretty important, and it's not only a function of the 3 networks. There's also newspapers, of course, and this was a big building this kind of thing was a big 20th century accomplishment in my view. The 19th century was a lot looser. Early newspapers would say just about anything. I guess I have an answer. So I guess we'll find out. But a lot of this has to do with the platforms and the birth of social media, because they themselves did not see themselves as media organizations. So at least for most of the last 15 years have felt that anything goes. So the biggest development for this, this is a big topic, is them starting to act. I think the biggest development in this area, by far, and the one that I think conservatives are the most concerned about, to pick up what David's talking about, is the media. We could say that maybe what has been happening over the last 3 or 4 years is that the platforms are starting to absorb and pick up and act according to media journalistic ethics and what they're doing. And that is in some ways what this battle is over.
David, do you want to weigh in there?
Sure, I'll be brief since I largely agree with Tim, and just say, like so many of our democratic problems today, I see Trump as cause and consequence. He's exacerbated pre-existing trends that were already degrading norms of democratic discourse. It seems to me, Tim noted changes in media structure, changes in technology, the general way in which divisive and inflammatory, if not outright untruthful content, tends to spread faster online and on social media platforms than on old media platforms. All of these helped give rise to Trump, that we have a more polarized media culture in which falsehoods can spread at scale, that helped create the conditions under which he could thrive politically, and he's exploited them. But per Tim's idea of a natural experiment we're about to enter, I suspect we're still going to be having tough conversations about disinformation, harassment online, government secrecy and so on under the Biden administration. And this is not by any means a Trump-specific phenomenon.
Matt, do you want to
Yeah,
jump in?
I'm pessimistic because I've spent the last 7 or 8 years now just studying the history of how new administrations promise when they come in, that they're going to be more open and accountable and transparent, and then every single one of them has gone back on those promises. So yes, I'm not very optimistic in this case about what we might see, what might be different with the Biden administration. I mean, what was amazing about, there's so many amazing things, right? But one thing about the Trump administration is that, like his predecessors, he came into office saying that he was going to be, unlike every other president before him, he was going to be far more open. He was going to declassify, for instance, all the records from the Kennedy assassination. At the same time, he was going to reveal much more about surveillance of his own campaign, for instance. And he did some of that, right? Some of these things. But, on the other hand, he seemed to have little, if any, interest in, government policy, right? That's run out of the White House on what it is classified and what gets declassified. So he didn't bother at any point, to intervene, in any fundamental way, which for many of us might be all to the good, right? That Trump didn't take more of an interest in government regulation on what information, classified information, gets released. But over the longer run, he's really one in the long line of presidents who wanted sovereign control over what it is classified as national security information. Now, just one last point, it may seem like, how is this exactly about the First Amendment? I mean, in what way is this censorship? I work with declassified records for many years, and I got used to looking at redacted documents, some of them 50 and 75 years old, still mostly redacted with those black boxes. And one day I had a student talk about, she was a data science student. She was doing an analysis of how much of the CIA document gets declassified, how has that changed over time, is indifferent for different topics and so on. And she described it as censorship. And I was going to correct her and say, no, this isn't censorship. This is, they're redacting national security information or personal information and so on. But over time, when you look at the patterns in what it is the government doesn't want us to know, whether it's about government surveillance, whether it's about control of nuclear weapons, whether, for instance, like civilians actually control the nuclear arsenal, those are things that have been getting classified and not released for so long now, it becomes clear that those are topics the government doesn't want us to talk about. Right? And they make it difficult for us to discuss these things because we don't have basic facts. Yes. So in fact, the First Amendment, when we think about it, is very much, extremely important in the realm of national security information. And it's also, by the way, quite helpful for professors like me who'd like to do research in this area, because it is the ultimate protection that we have to be able to speak and do research freely, including using data science techniques and trying to understand what the government didn't want us to know.
Tim, go ahead.
So I think just to pick up on the Biden administration, the key question, I think, is whether, as I think many of us hope, that the Biden administration represents some kind of return to normalcy in how the presidency conducts itself with respect to information and its role in the information environment. There is an outside chance, not like Biden doesn't seem to be like this kind of guy, but that Trump manages to establish a new normal as to what happens, how presidency sees its relationship with, there was this enormous advantage conveyed to Trump by being able to go on Twitter with his personal account, not the White House account, reach, I don't remember how many followers he had, but like 50 million or something like that. Just say exactly what you want to say. If you think of it from a politician's perspective, that's a very alluring thing than having to sort of convince some TV host to run you or, listen to their questions or whatever, just that direct line. I think it would be weird if Biden would start spouting conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, starting to take advantage of this in extensive forms on sort of unfact-checked means, unmediated means. Maybe there'd be some good things about that. There's always a danger of this is like a prisoner's dilemma or something, a mutual compact. Staying away from lying is something people have to do. And if I worry the Democratic Party gets worried that it's in a sucker's game, standing up for the truth or something like that, or these old-fashioned journalistic ethics and anyway, that's the danger.
That's interesting. I mean, I think one constraining factor for Biden could be the way his base would respond to that kind of direct to the people communication if it included a lot of lies, right? I mean, Trump has a base, which I think he's helped create the conditions for a base that celebrates that and believes him rather than the media. I'm not sure that the Democratic base would go for that in the same way, not because I think the left is like smarter than the right, just because it's taken a while, and that was it took grooming like decades from Fox of saying that the traditional media was full of fake news, and Trump was able to capitalize on that.
Yeah,
David, do you want to?
I think you have to. Oh, well, go ahead if you wanted to.
I agree with Emily's comment. I don't think Biden is, either politically or temperamentally a kind of charismatic demagogue, in the way Trump is, and that will constrain him. But per Matt's previous comment, some legal scholars distinguish between the personal presidency and the institutional presidency. And I think we've now shifted, we're about to shift to a personal president who is a better actor in terms of upholding norms of reasoned deliberation and honesty in public comment. But the institutional presidency, the kind of thick, bureaucratic surround around the individual that actually controls a lot of information flow, at least through traditional channels. Matt's point, I think, will remain deeply invested in national security secrecy. So I expect continuity on the institutional front and hopefully discontinuity on the personal front in who we're getting as president.
Right. I mean, we're kind of straddling these big topics here. There's disinformation from the government, and then there's secrecy from the government. And it's on the secrecy front, especially with regard to national security, where Matt's points are really well taken. So what do we do about all of this? Is the American free speech tradition, which has come out of our First Amendment, but now, goes beyond that into other kinds of laws, into a lot of Supreme Court jurisprudence, which is not entirely, but somewhat absolutist in its conception of free speech. Do we have to go back and change some of that in order to effectively address this? Are the Europeans or the Canadians in a better position because they have recognized limits on speech more than we have because of their different historical traditions? That's a very sweeping question, I realize, but I feel like it would be good to shift the conversation a little bit into solutions for the problems that you all have brilliantly outlined.
I think it's a challenging question. I think that where the action is, like the most important thing by far happening in free expression right now is the content moderation policies of the platforms, like by a factor of 1,000. And this is part of why, this would be my new version of why the First Amendment's obsolete. That is becoming the story. And even in Europe, where you speak, where you have more room under European speech versions of the First Amendment to sort of ban hate speech or things like that, it's still delegated to the platforms. And that's because, the scale problems of having millions of takedowns or thousands of takedowns every day, there's no human courts that anyone thinks can handle that unless you set up something like the Social Security Administration times 10 or something. And so government is kind of out of this picture, and which is difficult. Here we are, well, two of us are law professors, and Emily, you're a lawyer, and we sort of immediately say, okay, what are we gonna do about changing the law here? But I think this is, I always think the law has a monopoly on the use of force, so the law always has this importance, and I've never been one to exaggerate the degree, but you can kind of monkey around the edges, but for talking about something that I want, ultimately it is gonna come down to how the platforms enforce it. I just wanna make sure that's clear, that's the mechanism. So I'll start us out there.
David?
Maybe I have no great solutions, but maybe a kind of broad framing of the legal dimensions of the problem will be useful. So I see two main types of responses when it comes to First Amendment law to the sorts of problems we're discussing that I've described it as maximalist and minimalist. Tim's chapter, interestingly, kind of toggles between the two. So maximalist responses are people who say, we have a dysfunctional speech environment in the following ways. The solution is to beef up judicially enforced First Amendment law. So Matt Connelly writes a chapter telling us there's too much national security secrecy. There needs to be a judicially enforceable right to know what the government's doing, including in some sensitive areas. Or there needs to be a right to leak for government whistleblowers who bring important, problems to public light. And these solutions basically would ask judges to do more and more to get us to a better and better speech environment, even though recent cases have dissatisfied many liberals. I tend to be pessimistic about maximalist solutions given the current tendencies of the Supreme Court and the way it conceptualizes free speech issues, being very focused on speakers as against listeners' interests, and being insensitive generally to the quality of the overall expressive environment, in my view. The second bucket of solutions are minimalist ones, which basically ask the First Amendment to get out of the way. And they, rather than seek more from courts, they would just have it be the case that should Congress or administrative agencies try to incentivize, encourage, require social media companies to change their content moderation practices, as Tim was suggesting, or collect less data from people insofar as that chills their speech as well as their privacy, courts would just not see it as a First Amendment problem, stay out of the way. And we'd give greater scope for political solutions. I tend to think that's generally a better way to think about how to proceed. But of course, I haven't addressed the question of what exactly would be the good reforms that courts should avoid striking down. But just in general, I think given that a lot of the problems flow from private platforms, a lot of solutions have to be thought of outside of First Amendment terms.
Right.
Matt, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so
No,
I agree, with Tim that, certainly in terms of what's visible to us, especially those of us who spend more time than I do on social media, it's going to be the moderating of content. I think that's going to be drawing the most attention and probably the most controversy. I would just ask everyone to think about what's happening that you may not hear about, maybe not for a long time. Think about the things, again, that have to do with what we know and what we can know. We just last week had a report out of Politico about how it is, the HHS, a Trump appointee, was directing that email get destroyed, that appeared to show and did show White House tampering with what the CDC was trying to do about the COVID pandemic. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if we want to be able to talk about matters that matter in the public arena, we have to know what we're talking about. And unfortunately, just to take one example, the Presidential Records Act has effectively no enforcement mechanism. And so Trump could, if he chose to, and I think this is already what he's doing effectively and quietly, is he could destroy every record from his White House. And there's nothing we could do to stop him. Right. So those are the kinds of issues I think that we also should be thinking about and trying to do something about. And that would take legislation, right, if we wanted to enforce or reinforce the Presidential Records Act.
Tim, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to respond a little bit to some of the stuff in the comments and Q&A a little bit, since we already go there. And Emily, I said we shouldn't get into the weeds on immunity, but since it's coming up, I'm going to give a little riff on that. Probably make some enemies in the process, but
oh, good.
I think there is a lot of people who think that the solution needs a lie, and these platforms, they have too much immunity. Big grant
from Section 230.
Yes, we're talking about Section 230. So, which is sort of jargon for an immunity, and they have this immunity, and that's and so there is what I would call both a liberal and a conservative fantasy that you get rid of that law and it improves things. And I don't agree with that. I wouldn't. First of all, I would say I'm not someone who's a great friend of the platforms, but one of the so this law, without getting into too much details, provides some immunity to the platforms for what's on their platforms, and I think the conservative, let's say the liberal version of the fantasy is, well, there's way too much disinformation, insanity, conspiracy theory being out there, and the platforms don't have any kind of liability for it or any kind of responsibility. So if you get rid of this, then they're responsible. But unfortunately, it doesn't follow at all. Newsmax, ONI, Gateway Pundit, Breitbart, all these guys are directly liable for what they put out there. And that is the strongest conspiracy theory you'll see anywhere. Alex Jones, another example. It's not illegal to publish conspiracy theory. So, the idea that Facebook will suddenly become this feel incredibly responsible, maybe they'll feel morally responsible, but there's no legal responsibility for republishing conspiracy theories. And so it doesn't, or disinformation, it's protected speech under the First Amendment. So unless we're, I don't think it fixes the problem that liberals want it to. What it does is subject the platforms to a lot of defamation liability. So if you start saying things like, hey, my boss is I think my boss is a sexual harasser, or my boss is beating his wife or something. Well, that stuff gets taken down. So all the stuff that you might say about figures of authority who are not public figures, which is potentially, they got to take all that down because it's so dangerous to keep it up. So I just don't, and the conservatives are even crazier. They think that this is going to, I don't know. I guess for the conservatives, it's sort of a weapon to use against the platforms that makes sense. But the takedown, the conservatives are upset. They feel the conservative speech is taken down and discriminated against. Those are the acts of the platforms, and therefore, if there's something illegal about that, the platforms are liable. So I think that's like a strange obsession that people have gone very far on, but I think it's the wrong tree. If I can just say one last thing about this. The really strange thing in our age, as I open it up, is that Republicans, and I think even David, you once said you thought this was a good idea, maybe, have gotten the idea that maybe what they want is a fairness doctrine for social media. So that is to say, they want a law that requires social media, when they address anything, or if Facebook has, I don't even know what it would mean, but if any issue shows up, the social media has to condition its algorithm so that both sides get a fair say on it or something like that. I think that's what, or at least aren't taken down. Anyway, it's astonishing to me that the Republicans or the right wants that. I'm curious, Dave. Can I ask Dave the question? Are you in favor of that kind of thing? Since in some editing process, you said you thought it was a good idea.
No, I'm pessimistic that it could work. The only position to which I'm committed is that versions of it could be constitutional. So I have that's my constitutional perspective. But for reasons you outlined, I'm pessimistic that it would be very effective.
So I think what you're saying, Tim, is that eliminating the immunity protection from lawsuits in Section 230 is a poor fit for the actual problems that we see. And I get that, but I also have been drawn to proposals by people like Danielle Citron or Ellen Goodman, where they're talking about some kind of limit on immunity, or in Ellen's case, a quid pro quo, where the platforms would keep their immunity from lawsuit, but they would have to do some things to earn it from the government's point of view. And this would still put them in the seat of content moderation, because I think you're right. Like, nobody imagines really a federal or even EU Department of Content Moderation where you turn that over to people who work for the government. But the notion that the platforms, even if they set their own rules, should then have to prove that they're actually doing what they say they do. Speaking of transparency and disclosure of information, another huge black box of secrecy in our world is like, what are they doing and what impact is it having? There's some limited data that comes out through sources like CrowdTangle, but a lot where we have to take the word of Facebook when it says that it's, not amplifying false speech as much, and that's changing people's sharing habits. Like, we don't know. There are no independent researchers in there verifying that that's actually having that impact. So I wonder what you think of that kind of change of the government's role with the platforms, because it seems to me otherwise we're constantly in this position of complaining that the platforms have all the power, and then appealing to Mark Zuckerberg in particular as like the czar that we have to somehow like get on board for these principles of media ethics when in fact all of his business incentives lie in the opposite direction, because the way the algorithms work, the way that they amplify speech, keeps people online, keeps them engaged, generates more data for the platforms to sell to advertisers.
Yeah, so let me say two things about that. So first, overall, I think I am more attracted to the European approach of telling the platforms that these are kind of categories of information that we think you should be taking down. Direct incites to violence, true threats, harassment, revenge pornography, incitements to violence. Maybe I said that one already. Have a bunch of categories like that and say, these are things that we expect you to be doing something about. So that's what I believe in. I think that's a lot different in hoping that stripping immunities gets you there, and hoping that the private bar sues in the right ways to make that happen. That's what I've always thought is weird about it. The mechanism of stripping immunity is then you are hoping that there's a law in place that then, the private bar can do something about if they're incentivized to sue and have the right plaintiff, which is, the private bar has tort bar has unusual incentives. A lot of it, defamation is the biggest target. So I would just tell them to do what to do directly. Now, is that constitutional? That's the hard question, because it is saying some speech is harmful. Some of it I think it is, like true threats and so forth, harassment, up the hell's hell. But let me say one last thing about 230. I'm not an absolutist about not doing anything. I think there are some sites that do hide behind 230. There's a case in the Wisconsin Supreme Court that was like this, where there's a site that sells guns, and they're called, I forgot the name.com, but let's call it gunsales.com. And they are willing to sell guns to people who have criminal records, who don't go through background checks, guns that are illegal. And it's all under the fiction that, well, they're not selling the guns, people are selling each other the guns, right? So that kind of thing where you're directly inciting legal violations, I think 230 shouldn't exist in that context. But as a solution to the disinformation problem, I think it is completely barking up the wrong tree, and is like a random walk of strange things that would happen, mostly involving enormous weird class actions.
So I want to bring in more explicitly some of the questions. David Lelyville asked a question about the way we're describing the 1960s. He's asking, is the idealization of the 1960s justified? Consider the lies of LBJ and Nixon with respect to Vietnam, and the self-censoring of media documented in Todd Gitlin's The World is Watching, and also the censorship of textbooks. I do wonder about this myself as someone who's not actually alive in the 1960s, whether I hark back to it as this better era only because I wasn't here to experience its problems. Matt, I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. We don't want to idealize the 1960s at all, because some of the classic works of media studies, were precisely focused on the way in which first newspapers and then television networks covered the Vietnam War. And this is still something I teach to my students. So more and more, it's only a historical interest. But, this was a time in which, as was said at the time, Walter Cronkite could declare the end of the Vietnam War because a handful of anchors in the major networks had such a platform and had such an audience. But in fact, what they would normally talk about was what officials here believe. Much of what was discussed in the public arena, was constrained, by journalistic practices that privileged the voices of typically officials in government, or what we'd now think of as a mainstream that had very narrow bounds, because a lot of, opinion had been ruled out of bounds, whether it was opinions of communists or even socialists on the one hand, or the John Birch Society on the other. So no, I wouldn't want to go back to that time. It was also a time in which people had tremendous and misplaced faith in government. So before the Watergate revelations and everything else that came out around that time, like the Church Committee hearings and so on, the government was doing horrendous things in secret that at the time nobody really suspected. Now we're in a time now where it's hard to keep anything secret, or it seems that way anyway. We're wrong about that, but certainly it's different than it was then, and I think in that way it's better.
Right. Can I get back in on this? So you have to admit the music was pretty good, right?
I totally admit that.
The music was good, and I mean, people have different senses of fashion, but I thought the Mad Men episodes before they hit the 70s, they were, anyway, some of the design was very good. But
I like your apartment, Tim. You know, it seems like it's straight out of Mad Men, isn't it?
So, but I think the question of, yeah, I also reject golden age fallacies. I'm prone to them. Many people are. It's easy to think that some point was like perfect and they had it right. But no, I don't believe that. So, but it's more. I think talking about the 60s, 50s is important for talking about what kind of what problem do you want more of? You don't get a free pass. Like, I think one of the reactions to the 60s and 50s and the centralization of news reporting is like, okay, well, what we need is a million flowers bloom and no restricted. And that was kind of the idea of the internet. In fact, I was into it. And the idea that doesn't lead to its own set of problems is what we need to resist. So, you have to have a choice. You have too much centralized control, and therefore we'll have a little bit too much censorship. Some views cannot get heard at all, and that's a problem. Or you have, I would say, but I think there's also such a thing as too little any mediation or a control or a curation of information, which makes it easy to use propaganda, disinformation techniques, easily to manipulate people, and ends up with a lot of falsehood in the public arena. And that is its own set of dangers. And so we kind of, if we look back at like 1950s and the 2010s, maybe we can look at those of the polls, and maybe the perfect was somewhere, I don't know.
The 70s?
70s, or I don't know where they were. Also very good music, a little more.
Fashion was problematic, however.
Very, very good music in that period as well. And yeah, but that's, anyway, there we go.
Right. So you're taking a kind of Goldilocks position, which is always where I personally end up landing in these discussions. I wanted to bring in another question from Dina Mufti. She's asking whether social media companies could be taxed, with the resulting money going toward an international independent regulatory body overseeing their content moderation practices and privacy settings. Is that an appealing idea? Does it pose any constitutional problems? What about the kind of international centralized authority that envisions? David, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, there are certainly versions of attacks on certain sorts of publishers, if that's how to think of these companies, that could be unconstitutional. But there could be ways to design attacks, I think, that would pass First Amendment scrutiny if it was done in some content neutral fashion and platforms was defined broadly. And okay, it's probably not worth going down that rabbit hole, but I think it could be done. But the bigger question I would have is to what end? So some people have proposed a US version of a BBC to counter, extreme media outlets or unreliable media outlets with an authoritative presenter of the news. But given the degree of media polarization that already exists and what seemed to me the likely preferences of American consumers, I just have a hard time seeing an American BBC capturing enough market share to really do the work of creating epistemic coherence that I think the proposal seeks. So I think it's constitutionally permissible, and I would be open to versions of an American BBC or whatever other use of this money is done for civic education to help people better be smarter consumers of news and on guard against conspiracy theories. But I think the reality is, unless you fundamentally change what appear to be people's demand for that kind of content, and the structure of the platforms and how they make money, these seem to me like very marginal reforms, either the civic education one or the government as broadcaster one, relative to the scope of the problem.
One thing I would like on this, and I'll try not to go on forever, So I've been, waiting for a while for a PBS NPR equivalent in the social media, which is to say, the NPR and PBS were launched in the 60s as a reaction to the idea that the broadcasting was all private and we needed a, public as some kind of check. So I like the idea of a public social network that relies possibly on a tiny amount of donor revenue or on, it could be tax or it could be a subscription revenue, but non-advertising driven. I've sort of been trying to talk them into this over the last 5 years, but no one.
Who's them? The government?
Yes. PBS, Public
PBS.
Public Broadcasting. Now, the chance they could launch it, no one would sign up, and that would be.
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, that's David's concern is market share and like.
But they start, after we successfully break up Facebook, and there's and PBS buys Instagram or something like that. I'm just saying, if you change the conditions of competition in social media to begin with, logic suggests to me, even if PBS, you might have said this about PBS, but who's going to watch this thing, right? And
then they had Sesame Street. They just need Sesame Street. They could get the youth.
Yeah, it took a while, but I'm just talking about the public media's next frontier should be social media.
That's interesting. I kind of think it should be local news. I still hold out hope for publicly funded local news that could be, because we're having these news deserts and it's such an unserved need. Let me bring in a question from Kenneth Pruitt. If Columbia University wanted to illustrate its own behavior, ideal practices, what data might the university make available that were not? And he gives a few different examples, statistics on the number of students who had mediocre teachers who were tenured for their research. You could use student ratings for that. Whether the university is putting football and soccer players at risk for CTE, and then when legacy recruits of rich parents are judged to be likely future donors. Matt, since you're our anti-secrecy person in this conversation, what should universities be thinking about? I mean, they're private institutions. They have lots of reasons not to want to divulge any of these things, but it is really interesting.
Sure. Columbia is a hard case, because it's a private institution. Just to give an example, a few years ago, I tried to get an initiative started where Columbia researchers, and there are a lot of us, there are thousands of us who are interested in all kinds of issues that would be very relevant, to the administration, to the student body, issues of student wellness, issues of, are we evaluating scholarship correctly? How do we promote better teaching? A lot of these kinds of questions could be researched with more rigor, like if we had access to all of the data that Columbia and other universities collect. And so, I talked to the people, right? There are actually people at Columbia who, manage internal data, but they mainly work on helping Columbia in the US News and World Report rankings. That is the main thing that they do. And they have their equivalents at every other university and college, right? The people who manage internal data are typically working on it to try to improve, the student faculty ratios and the alumni giving numbers and everything else that generates like our all important ranking at the end of the year. And I could get almost no interest in the idea that, hey, we have these problems, right? Like about self-harm among students, like these things might be correlated with all kinds of other things, like the classes they take and where they live and all the rest of it. And there was no interest in pursuing this. So unfortunately, Columbia is very stingy with information, even for the people who work here, right? Even when we want to do things for the university. The counterexample would be public universities. So public universities are governed by, whatever sunshine law exists in that state. And it hasn't necessarily had a very good effect because, for example, teachers or professors, all of them are routinely harassed by people, yes, exactly, who submit these sunshine or FOIA or FOIL requests and are able, entitled in many cases to see all of their internal communications. Another example would be how you can now, look up the salaries of virtually any, professor at a public university in the United States. That may provide, some interest, for some people for some of the time, but I'm not sure the privacy implications of that, are really outweighed, by the public benefit, if any, that we get from that information.
Yeah, well, it's also an interesting example of how if you have a different rule for private and public institutions, then you create perhaps outrage around public university professor salaries, when actually if you could see the private equivalents, you would have a different picture.
You'd be shocked. There's been virtually no increase vis-a-vis inflation in professors' salaries for as long as anybody's been keeping track of it.
Maybe I'll
David?
just pipe in here to say, I think in questions of secrecy, it's often useful to ask about the distribution of openness and secrecy across whatever university you're looking at. So here you're noting public university professors experience a kind of tax, because they're subject to open records and open meetings laws that their private counterparts are not, and that can skew choices about where people go to work and also our sense of where problems reside. I just want to note the same thing is true at the governmental level with the problems Matt was discussing earlier. So he notes that in the national security realm, the US government is very secretive. Over the same time period Matt's been discussing, the US government got world historically transparent in other areas, like the work of ordinary non-law enforcement or national security related regulatory agencies. The National Labor Relations Board, the Environmental Protection Agency are some of the most transparent administrative bodies in the world at this point. And they just get deluged with FOIA requests and critical media stories that result, and from corporate lobbyists who seek information that they can then use against regulators or competitors. And so I would just characterize the problem of secrecy in the US government, not just as about being too much in certain areas, but also the asymmetries it creates, where the most violent components of the US government are the least visible and therefore get the least of certain kinds of pushback. And the actually kind of generally well-run regulatory agencies doing ordinary regulatory enforcement, civil rights enforcement work have a real problem with open records and open government laws being used against them in destructive ways. So the problem generalizes is all I want to say there.
That seems like a good note to end on, because it's about competing pressures, which is so much of this conversation about free speech comes down to competing values, competing pressures, trade-offs, looking for that kind of Goldilocks sweet spot that Tim was pointing to earlier. So I'm going to close this out. Since we're at time, thank you all so much for participating in this rich discussion. And I really, really recommend The Perilous Public Square to anyone who has not picked it up. It is just really smart and fruitful reading that made me understand this topic in much more detail and complexity than I had before. Thank you, Matt and Tim and David and Ipek Cem.